He pressed his last silver dollar into the trembling hands of a starving Arikara woman, clutching twin babies in the bitter Montana snow, never knowing she owned the richest silver mine in the territory, the very mine that had cost him everything he'd ever loved. The winter of 1878 had teeth sharper than a Bowie knife, and Logan Cross felt every one of them as he trudged through the knee-deep snow toward Copper Falls. His boots, more whole than leather, crunched against the frozen ground with each labored step. The wind howled through the pine trees like the voices of dead miners, carrying with it the bitter promise of another night without shelter, another day without decent food. Every breath he took felt like swallowing ice, and the cold had long since worked its way through his threadbare coat to settle deep in his bones.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Logan pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, feeling the familiar weight of his last silver dollar pressing against his ribs through the torn pocket lining. That single coin represented everything he had left in this world after 3 years of backbreaking labor in the Blackstone mine had earned him nothing but a cough that rattled his chest and scars that mapped every cave-in, every explosion, every moment he'd cheated death for 50 cents a day. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was carrying silver while slowly starving to death in Silver Country, where fortunes were made and lost with each swing of a pickaxe. He'd been a different man once, before the mine, before Sarah died of consumption in that rat-infested boarding house while he was underground, digging silver for rich men who'd never set foot in Montana territory, before her funeral that he couldn't afford, where they buried her in a pine box so cheap it split before they got it in the ground, before he learned that the Blackstone Mining Company had been cheating workers out of their wages for years, paying them in script that was worthless anywhere but the company store, where a loaf of bread cost 3 days' wages and a pound of bacon could bankrupt a family. Sarah had been pregnant when she died. The baby would have been born in the spring, would have been walking by now, maybe saying its first words. Logan carried that weight heavier than any ore cart he'd ever pushed through the mine tunnels. He'd failed as a husband, failed as a father, before he'd even had the chance to try. Failed at everything except staying alive when dying might have been a mercy. The mining camp of Copper Falls sat in the valley between two massive peaks, a collection of ramshackle buildings that looked like they'd been thrown together by men who expected to be dead or rich within a year. Most ended up dead. The lucky ones got to be poor. The unlucky ones got to be Logan Cross. He'd worked every mine within 50 miles, following silver veins deeper into the earth, watching good men disappear in rockfalls and gas explosions, while the mine owners counted their profits in San Francisco. Mansions they'd never have to leave. The Blackstone mine dominated the eastern ridge like a canker on the mountainside. Its headframe rose against the sky like a gallows, and the constant thump of the stamp mill echoed through the valley day and night, crushing ore and dreams with equal efficiency. Logan had spent the better part of 2 years in those tunnels, breathing rock dust and praying the timbers would hold for one more shift. He'd seen men cough up blood and keep working because they couldn't afford to be sick. He'd helped carry out bodies when the mountain decided to claim its due. As he crested the hill overlooking the camp, Logan could see smoke rising from a dozen chimneys, the warm glow of kerosene lamps in windows that might as well have been on the moon for all the comfort they offered him. The town spread below him like a miniature version of hell, complete with its own devils in the form of company foremen and store owners, who squeezed every penny from the workers' pockets. He had no money for lodging, no friends who weren't buried in the hillside cemetery, no prospects beyond hoping someone needed an extra hand for day labor that would pay just enough to keep him breathing for another day. The main street of Copper Falls was a muddy scar carved between buildings that leaned against each other like drunks afraid to fall down alone. The Mercantile stood at one end, its windows displaying goods that working men could look at but never afford canned. Peaches from California, wool blankets from back east, patent medicines that promised to cure everything from consumption to heartbreak. Next to it squatted Murphy's Saloon, where miners spent their wages trying to forget what they'd seen in the dark places beneath the earth. The assay office occupied the most prominent corner, its brass scales and careful measurements determining the difference between prosperity and poverty for every claim holder in the territory. Behind it, like a fortress guarding the town's wealth, stood the Blackstone Company offices, a two-story building that looked substantial enough to survive the apocalypse while everything around it crumbled to dust. The boarding house where Sarah had died sat across from it, a cruel reminder of how close the company kept its victims. Logan's stomach cramped with hunger as he passed Murphy's Saloon, where the warm smell of beef stew and fresh bread leaked through the batwing doors, along with the sound of men's laughter and the clink of glasses. He'd eaten nothing but hardtack and melted snow for 2 days, and even that meager fare was gone now. His body was consuming itself, burning muscle for fuel, and he could feel his strength ebbing with each step. A bowl of stew cost 50 cents more than many men made in a day, more than Logan had seen in weeks. Pride had kept him from begging so far, but pride was a luxury he was rapidly running out of. A man could swallow his pride, or he could starve, and Logan had learned that dignity was poor seasoning for an empty belly. He'd watched proud men reduced to scavenging scraps behind the saloon, had seen former foremen reduced to sleeping in mine shafts when their luck ran out. Montana Territory had a way of grinding down pretensions along with everything else. The wind picked up as he reached the far end of town, carrying with it something that made him stop in his tracks. Not the usual sounds of the camp, the distant hammering from the stamp mill, the shouts of teamsters wrestling their wagons through the mud, the melancholy wail of the evening train whistle as it carried silver ore and broken dreams toward distant cities. This was different, quieter, more human. The soft, desperate sound of a woman crying, muffled by the storm but unmistakably real and filled with a desperation that cut through the wind like a knife. Logan followed the sound around the corner of the abandoned livery stable, where the wind had carved deep drifts against the north wall and the snow lay pristine except for a few animal tracks. What he saw there would have stopped a harder man than him cold. A young Arikara woman sat huddled against the building's foundation, her back pressed to the weathered boards, her dark hair whipping around her face in the bitter wind like a war banner torn from its staff. In her arms, she held 2 bundles, twin babies, no more than a few months old, wrapped in what looked like pieces of an old deer hide blanket that had seen better decades. The woman couldn't have been more than 25, but her face bore the kind of lines that came from carrying weight no person should have to bear alone. Her dress, once probably beautiful with its intricate beadwork and careful stitching, was now torn and stained with mud and worse things, offering little protection against the Montana cold that cut through fabric like it was made of paper. Beadwork told stories, traditional patterns that spoke of family, of heritage, of a world that existed before white men came digging holes in sacred mountains. Her feet, wrapped in strips of cloth and leather that might once have been moccasins, were blue with cold where they peeked out from beneath her skirts. She rocked back and forth in a rhythm that seemed older than the mountains themselves, humming softly to the babies in a voice that cracked with exhaustion and grief. Logan could see her strength failing with each passing moment, could see the way her arms trembled as she tried to keep the twins warm with her own failing body heat. One of the twins, a little girl with her mother's dark eyes and delicate features, was crying with the thin, desperate wail of a hungry child, the sound cutting through the wind like a saw through wood. The other, a boy, lay too still in his mother's arms, his tiny face pale and pinched with cold, his breathing so shallow that Logan had to watch carefully to see any movement at all. The sight of those children hit him harder than any cave-in, harder than any foreman's fist, harder than the news of Sarah's death. The woman looked up as Logan approached, and he saw something in her eyes that hit him like a physical blow. Not fear, though she had every reason to be afraid of a strange man approaching in the wilderness.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Not shame, though society had given her plenty of reasons to feel it. Instead, he saw the kind of resigned desperation that came from having knocked on every door, begged at every threshold, and found them all barred against her and her children. "Ma'am," Logan said softly, pulling off his hat despite the wind that immediately tried to snatch it from his fingers. The gesture was automatic, drilled into him by a mother who'd insisted that a man always showed respect to a lady, regardless of circumstances. "You can't stay out here. This storm's going to get worse before it gets better. And these babies." His voice was rougher than he'd intended, gravelly from years of breathing rock dust and trying to make himself heard over the noise of mining equipment and the screams of injured men. The woman looked at him with eyes the color of river stones, taking in his worn clothes, his hollow cheeks, his obvious poverty with the practiced assessment of someone who'd learned to judge quickly whether a stranger represented help or harm. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the musical cadence of her people's language beneath the carefully pronounced English words. "I have nowhere else to go. The boarding house, they say no Indians allowed. The church, they say no room for heathens. The company offices, they say I owe money for my husband's death." Her accent was slight but noticeable, each word carefully chosen and precisely delivered. Logan felt something cold settle in his stomach. That had nothing to do with the weather. "Your husband worked for Blackstone?" The question came out harsher than he'd intended, but the company's name tasted like poison in his mouth. "He died in the cave-in last month," she said, her voice dropping even lower. "Number 3 shaft. They say he was careless, that he ignored safety rules. They say he owed money to company store, that his death settled the debt, but left nothing for his family." She shifted the babies in her arms, trying to give them what little warmth her body still held. "They took our cabin, our horses, even his mining tools. Said everything belonged to company now." The words hit Logan like falling timber. He remembered the number 3 cave-in, remembered the way the company had hushed it up, blamed the dead miners for their own deaths, used the tragedy as an excuse to dock the survivors' pay for safety equipment that should have been provided in the first place. 3 men had died that day, crushed by tons of rock while digging silver for men who would never dirty their hands with honest labor. Logan knelt in the snow beside her, ignoring the way the cold immediately soaked through his torn pants and bit into his knees like wolf teeth. Up close, he could see that the babies were in even worse condition than he'd thought. The little girl's lips were tinged blue with cold, and her crying had taken on a desperate quality that spoke of hunger beyond anything a child should endure. The boy was so still that Logan had to watch carefully to see the tiny rise and fall of his chest, and even then he wasn't sure if what he was seeing was breathing or just wishful thinking. "How long have you been out here?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. 3 days, she whispered, then corrected herself. "Maybe 4. Time, it blurs together when you are this cold. When your children cry for food, you cannot give them." She looked down at the twins with a love so fierce it was painful to witness, the kind of love that would sacrifice everything and still feel it wasn't enough. "I came to town looking for work, for help, for anyone who might remember that my husband died. Making other men rich. What kind of work?" Logan asked, though he already knew the answer. There weren't many opportunities for Indian women in mining towns, and most of them involved surrendering more than just labor. Lilu's jaw tightened. "Any work. Cleaning, cooking, washing clothes. I can do beadwork, make beautiful things. But no one wants to buy beauty when they can buy whiskey instead." Her voice carried a bitterness that spoke of doors slammed in her face, of respectable women crossing the street to avoid her, of men who looked at her like she was merchandise rather than a human being. Logan felt something twist in his chest. A pain that had nothing to do with hunger or cold, but with the recognition of shared suffering, shared loss, shared abandonment by a world that measured human worth in silver ounces and stock certificates. These babies were the same age Sarah's child would have been if she'd lived long enough to give birth. If the company doctor hadn't been too drunk to attend to her when her time came. If Logan had been able to afford real medical care instead of relying on a man who treated minors' families like livestock that happened to walk upright. He thought about the silver dollar in his pocket, that beautiful coin minted in San Francisco. Worth more than most men in Copper Falls saw in a week of backbreaking labor. It was also the only thing standing between him and complete destitution. The only barrier between survival and the kind of death that came slowly, quietly, in alleys and abandoned buildings where no one would find the body until spring. But as he looked at those babies, at their mother's face etched with the kind of desperation that came from watching your children slowly die while being powerless to help them, Logan realized that some things mattered more than personal survival. Some things were worth the risk of dying for, and if he was going to die anyway, which seemed increasingly likely, at least he could die knowing he'd done one thing right. Without thinking, without calculating, without considering the consequences. For his own survival, Logan reached into his pocket and pulled out his silver dollar. The coin caught what little light filtered through the storm clouds, gleaming dully in his palm like a small piece of captured moonlight. It was a beautiful piece, heavy and substantial, marked with the eagle and stars that represented a country that had forgotten people like him and Lulu existed. "Here," he said, pressing the coin into Lou's cold hand, feeling her fingers. Close around it with desperate gratitude. "Take this. Get yourself and the babies somewhere warm tonight. Get them some food, some milk if you can find it." Her fingers were so cold, they felt like ice against his palm, but they trembled as they closed around the silver dollar. "I cannot," she whispered, staring at the coin like it was some kind of miracle she was afraid to believe in. "You need this money. I can see it in your face. You are hungry too. You are cold too. This might be all you have." Her observation was accurate and uncomfortable. Logan hadn't looked in a mirror in weeks, but he knew what she saw, a man worn down to nothing, surviving on stubbornness and the rapidly fading hope that tomorrow might be better than today. "I'll manage," Logan said, though he had no idea how. The words came out more confident than he felt, but he found that saying them made them feel almost true. Babies can't wait for better times. They can't eat pride or drink good intentions. You take that money and you get them warm tonight, you hear me? He stood up, brushing snow off his knees, already feeling the absence of the coin's weight in his pocket like a missing tooth. Lulu stared at the silver dollar in her palm as if she'd never seen money before, as if she couldn't quite believe that a stranger, a white stranger, no less, would give her everything he had without asking for anything in return. When she looked up at Logan again, there were tears freezing on her cheeks, turning into tiny diamonds that caught the failing light. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking on the word. "You do not know me. My people, your people, we have not always been friends. We have been enemies more often than not. Why would you give me everything you have when you owe me nothing?" Logan was quiet for a long moment, watching the snow swirl around them in the growing darkness, thinking about Sarah and the baby they'd never had, about all the small kindnesses that might have changed everything if they'd come at the right time. "Because somebody should have done the same for my wife," he said finally, his voice rough with emotions he'd kept buried for months. Maybe if they had, if someone had cared enough to help when she needed it most, she'd still be alive. Maybe that baby would be walking around somewhere, learning to talk, getting into trouble. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect that felt ancient and necessary. "You get those babies warm, Lulu, white dove. That's all that matters now." As Logan walked away, his feet crunching in the snow with each step that took, him further from warmth and closer to an uncertain night. He heard Lilu call out behind him. Her voice carried over the wind, strong despite her exhaustion, filled with something he couldn't quite identify. When he turned back, she was struggling to her feet, the twin still cradled in her arms, the silver dollar clutched in her free hand like a talisman. "What is your name?" she asked, and Logan realized he'd never introduced himself, had simply appeared out of the storm like some kind of guardian angel with empty pockets and worn-out boots. "Logan Cross," he said, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "And if you're smart, you'll forget you ever met me. This town has a way of punishing kindness, and I've got a feeling my luck's about to run out." But even as he said the words, he knew they weren't entirely true. He wouldn't forget her, wouldn't forget those babies or their mother's fierce love. And something told him their paths would cross again in ways he couldn't imagine. Lilu studied his face for a long moment, as if memorizing his features, and Logan had the strange feeling that she was seeing more than just another down-on-his-luck miner. "Logan Cross," she repeated, and the way she said his name made it sound different somehow, more important than it had ever sounded before. "I will not forget, and I will find a way to repay this kindness." "No need," Logan said, though something in her voice made him think she meant more than just paying back the dollar. "Just take care of those babies. That's payment enough. For any man." He turned away again, but her voice stopped him one more time. "Logan Cross," she called, and when he looked back, her eyes held a strange intensity that seemed to cut through the darkness like lamplight. "You have given me more than money tonight. You have given me hope. That is a debt that cannot be measured in silver dollars." Logan nodded, not trusting his voice, and walked away into the storm. Behind him, he could hear Lee moving toward the main street, her footsteps careful but determined, as she carried her children toward whatever warmth and safety his silver dollar might buy them. He didn't look back again. He'd learned that looking back only showed you what you'd lost, and he'd lost enough for several lifetimes. Better to keep moving forward, even if forward led into darkness. The wind was picking up again, driving the snow horizontally down the street like bullets made of ice. Logan pulled his hat down low and headed for the livery stable where he'd found Lilu, thinking that if he was lucky, there might be enough hay in the loft to keep him from freezing to death before morning. If he was very lucky, the owner wouldn't find him until after the storm passed and he could slip away without confrontation. Luck, however, had never been Logan Cross's strong suit, and he had no reason to think tonight would be different. As he settled into the musty darkness of the stable, breathing in the familiar scents of horses and leather and old hay, Logan tried not to think about the silver dollar, tried not to calculate how many meals it represented, how many nights of shelter, how many small comforts he'd just given away to strangers. Instead, he thought about the way Lilu had looked at her children, the fierce protectiveness in her eyes, the way she'd hummed to them even when she barely had strength to speak. Some things, he decided, were worth more than money, worth more than personal survival, worth the risk of dying for. But as the night deepened and the cold seeped through the stable walls like water through a sieve, Logan began to wonder if kindness was a luxury he could afford. He'd given away his last dollar to a woman he'd known for less than an hour, for children who might not survive the winter anyway, regardless of his sacrifice. In the morning, he'd have to find work or find food or find some way to stay alive for another day without any resources except his own failing strength. The mathematics of survival were simple and brutal, and Logan had just made them infinitely more complicated. Sleep, when it finally came, was filled with dreams of silver coins and crying babies, of mine shafts that led to nowhere and women with river stone eyes who spoke in riddles about hope and debt and repayment. Logan woke several times during the night, each time colder than before, each time more aware of the emptiness in his pocket and the uncertainty of tomorrow. But each time, he thought of those twins Kota and Leela and found that despite everything, Despite the cold and the hunger and the very real possibility that he'd just sentenced himself to death, he could sleep again. Dawn would bring new challenges, new decisions, new consequences for the choice he'd made in the snow outside the livery stable. The storm would pass, the sun would rise over Copper Falls, and Logan Cross would have to face another day with nothing but the clothes on his back and the knowledge that he'd done something decent in a world that seemed to have forgotten what decency looked like. Whether that would be enough to keep him alive remained to be seen. But for now, in the darkness of a Montana winter night, Logan Cross slept the sleep of a man who'd finally done something he could be proud of, even if it killed him. Dawn broke over Copper Falls like a reluctant promise, painting the snow-covered mountains in shades of rose and gold that would have been beautiful if Logan Cross hadn't been slowly freezing to death in a pile of moldy hay. He woke to the sound of horses stamping in their stalls below, their breath creating clouds of steam in the frigid air, and the distant clang of the breakfast bell at Murphy's saloon calling men to meals he couldn't afford. His body ached in ways that went beyond the usual complaints of sleeping rough. The cold had settled deep in his joints during the night, and his empty stomach cramped with a hunger that felt like claws tearing at his insides. Logan sat up slowly, brushing hay from his hair and beard, and tried to calculate how long a man could survive on nothing but melted snow and determination. The answer wasn't encouraging. Through a crack in the stable wall, he could see smoke rising from chimneys throughout the camp, families beginning their day with hot coffee and flapjacks, while he wondered if this would be the morning his body finally gave up the fight. But as he prepared to climb down from the loft, something caught his attention. Voices outside, speaking in urgent whispers just beyond the stable door. "You sure about this, Mrs. Pettigrew?" A man's voice asked, rough with the accent of someone who'd spent his life working with his hands. "Company finds out we're helping Indians, they'll make life real difficult for all of us." "William Thompson, you listen to me," came a woman's sharp reply, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "That poor girl and her babies nearly froze to death last night, and if it wasn't for that cross fellow giving her his last dollar, we'd be digging tiny graves come spring. I won't have such things happening in my boarding house. Company rules." "Or no company rules." Logan pressed his eye to the crack in the wall, trying to see who was speaking. Mrs. Pettigrew he recognized, a iron-haired woman in her 50s who ran the only decent boarding house in town with an efficiency that would have impressed a military quartermaster. She stood in the snow outside the stable, wrapped in a thick wool coat, speaking to Bill Thompson, one of the few independent prospectors left in the territory. "Besides," Mrs. Pettigrew continued, lowering her voice but not enough to escape Logan's hearing, "there's something strange about that Indian woman. The way she carries herself, the way she speaks, that's not the manner of someone who spent her life scraping by. And those clothes under all the dirt and wear, they were expensive once. Real expensive." Bill Thompson spat into the snow, a gesture of contempt that seemed directed at the world in general rather than the conversation at hand. "Expensive clothes don't mean much when you're sleeping in snowdrifts with babies. Could have stolen them. Could have been cast-offs from some rich lady back east. Indians ain't exactly known for their wealth in these parts." "Maybe not," Mrs. Pettigrew said, but her tone suggested she wasn't convinced. "But I've been running this boarding house for 15 years, and I've learned to read people. That woman's got secrets, mark my words. And from what I saw this morning when she paid for her room, those secrets might be worth more than we think." Logan's interest sharpened. What had Mrs. Pettigrew seen? He'd given Leilu a single silver dollar, enough for a night's shelter and perhaps a meal, but hardly sufficient to pay for anything more substantial. Yet something in the boarding house keeper's tone suggested there was more to the story. "Speaking of Cross," Bill Thompson said, glancing around as if he expected Logan to materialize from thin air. "Anyone seen him this morning? Man gives away his last dollar in weather like this. He's either a saint or a fool, and saints don't tend to last long in mining country. Mrs. Pettigrew's expression softened slightly. Poor man looked half dead when I saw him yesterday. Been carrying that grief over his wife like a millstone around his neck. Maybe helping that Indian woman gave him something he needed more than money, a reason to keep breathing. Or maybe it gave him a reason to stop, Bill muttered darkly. Man's got nothing left to live for. Gives away his last hope sounds like someone saying goodbye to me. The conversation was interrupted by the approach of heavy footsteps crunching through the snow, and Logan recognized the distinctive gait of Frank Morrison, one of Blackstone's assistant foremen, and a man who took particular pleasure in making miners' lives miserable. Morrison was the kind of person who'd kick a dog just to hear it yelp, and his presence never boded well for anyone. "Morning, folks," Morrison said, his voice carrying false cheer that fooled nobody. "Lovely day for a walk, wouldn't you say? Though I have to wonder what brings respectable people to the back end of town so early in the morning." Mrs. Pettigrew drew herself up to her full height, which wasn't particularly impressive physically, but seemed to add several inches to her presence. "Frank Morrison, I'll walk where I please when I please, and it's no concern of yours unless you're planning to pay for rooms at my establishment." Morrison's smile turned predatory. "Actually, Mrs. Pettigrew, I might have some business for you after all. Seems we had some excitement last night. An Indian woman and her babies took shelter at your boarding house. Company's got some questions." "About that arrangement? What kind of questions?" Bill Thompson asked, his hand moving casually to rest on the handle of the knife at his belt. Logan had seen that gesture before. It usually preceded violence. "Well now," Morrison said, apparently oblivious to the threat. "Company policy is pretty clear about Indians on company property. And since the boarding house sits on land leased from Blackstone, that makes it company property. We can't have unauthorized persons taking up residence, especially persons of questionable character and doubtful loyalty." Mrs. Pettigrew's face flushed red with anger. "Questionable character? That woman's husband died in your mine, Frank Morrison, and instead of offering his widow help, your company stole everything she had and threw her into the snow with 2 babies. If anyone's of questionable character around here, it's not her." Morrison's false cheer evaporated like steam from a kettle. "You'd better watch your tongue, old woman. The company has ways of dealing with troublemakers, and boarding house licenses can be revoked for violations of public safety and moral standards." "Is that a threat?" Bill Thompson asked, stepping closer to Morrison with the casual movement of a man who'd spent his life settling disputes with his fists. "It's a friendly warning," Morrison replied, but his voice had taken on an edge that suggested the friendliness was wearing thin. "The company takes care of its own, but it expects cooperation in return. This Indian situation needs to be resolved quickly and quietly, before it becomes a problem for everyone involved." Logan felt his jaw clench as he listened to the exchange. Morrison was typical of Blackstone's management small men drunk on borrowed power, using company authority to settle personal grudges and flex muscles they'd never developed through honest work. The fact that he was threatening Mrs. Pettigrew, one of the few decent people in Copper Falls, made Logan's hands itch for his old Navy Colt. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another figure, Dr. Sarah Whitman, the only physician in Copper Falls and one of the few people Morrison treated with anything approaching respect. Dr. Whitman was a rarity in mining country, a woman who'd managed to establish herself in a man's profession through sheer competence, and the simple fact that wounded miners didn't much care about their doctor's gender when they were bleeding to death. "Good morning, everyone," Dr. Whitman said, her voice carrying the kind of professional authority that came from having saved lives that other people had given up for lost. "I trust there's no medical emergency that requires my attention. Mr. Morrison, you look rather flushed. Perhaps you should consider reducing your morning constitutional if it's proving too strenuous." Morrison's face reddened further, but he managed to keep his voice level. No medical emergency, doctor. Just a community concern about unauthorized residents in town. Surely you understand the importance of maintaining proper health and safety standards. Dr. Whitman's eyebrows rose slightly. I see. And this unauthorized resident, would this be the young mother with twins I treated last night? Because I have to say, from a medical standpoint, she and her children were suffering from exposure and malnutrition, not any communicable disease that might threaten the community. You treated her? Mrs. Pettigrew asked, surprise evident in her voice. I thought she just needed shelter for the night. She did need shelter, Dr. Whitman replied, but she also needed medical attention. When she came to pay for her room last night, she collapsed in the hallway. Mrs. Chun from the laundry helped me get her upstairs, and I spent most of the night treating her and the babies for hypothermia and dehydration. Logan pressed closer to the crack in the wall, his heart racing with concern for Lulu and the twins. He'd hoped his silver dollar would be enough to keep them safe for one night, but it seemed their troubles were far from over. Is she going to be all right? Bill Thompson asked, and Logan was surprised to hear genuine concern in the prospector's voice. Those babies looked pretty rough when I saw them yesterday. Dr. Whitman nodded slowly. She'll recover, and so will the children, but it was closer than I'd like. Another night in that storm, and we'd have been planning funerals instead of treatment. As it stands, they'll need several days of rest and proper nutrition before they're strong enough to travel. Morrison seized on this information like a vulture spotting carrion. Several days? Doctor, you can't be serious. The company can't authorize extended residence for unauthorized persons, regardless of their medical condition. There are proper channels for these things, procedures that must be followed. Mr. Morrison, Dr. Whitman said, her voice taking on the kind of chill that could freeze water in July. I'm not asking for company authorization. I'm informing you of medical necessity. Those patients are under my care, and they'll remain under my care until I deem them fit to be discharged. If the company has a problem with that, they can take it up with the Territorial Medical Board. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Dr. Whitman held her medical license from the territorial government, not from Blackstone Mining, and challenging her professional judgment could bring unwanted attention from authorities, who might ask uncomfortable questions about company practices. Morrison clearly understood this, because his bluster deflated like a punctured balloon. Well, Morrison said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, I suppose medical necessity takes precedence over other considerations. But this is a temporary arrangement, you understand. Once the patients are fit to travel, alternative accommodations will need to be found. Of course, Dr. Whitman agreed pleasantly. I'm sure by then we'll all have a much better understanding of the situation. There was something in her tone that suggested she knew more than she was letting on, and Logan found himself wondering what the doctor had discovered during her night of treating Lulu. After Morrison stomped away through the snow, muttering under his breath about ungrateful Indians and meddling women, the remaining three continued their conversation in hushed tones. Logan strained to hear every word, sensing that something important was being discussed. Doctor, Mrs. Pettigrew said carefully, when you were treating that woman last night, did you notice anything unusual about her? Anything that might explain how she was able to pay for medical treatment when she'd been sleeping in the snow? Dr. Whitman was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing her words. Patient confidentiality prevents me from discussing most details of treatment, but I will say this: when someone pays for medical services with a $20 gold piece, it raises certain questions about their circumstances. Logan's breath caught in his throat. A $20 gold piece. That was more money than most miners saw in a month. Enough to live comfortably for weeks, even at inflated frontier prices. But he'd given Lulu only a single silver dollar. Where had she gotten such a substantial sum? Bill Thompson let out a low whistle. $20? Hell, Doc, that's more cash than I've seen in one place since I struck that small vein 2 summers back. You sure it wasn't counterfeit? I'm sure, Dr. Whitman replied. It was genuine and recently minted. The kind of coin you'd expect to see in a banker's vault, not in the possession of someone who'd been sleeping rough in a blizzard. Mrs. Pettigrew shook her head in amazement. I told you there was something strange about that woman. People don't carry that kind of money, unless they've got access to more where it came from. But if she's got $20 gold pieces, why was she sleeping in the snow? Why didn't she just buy passage on the stage and leave town? Maybe she can't leave, Dr. Whitman suggested. Maybe she's waiting for something or someone. Or maybe she's got reasons for staying that we don't understand yet. Logan's mind raced as he tried to piece together this new information. Lilu had claimed her husband died in the mine cave-in, that the company had taken everything and left her with nothing. But if she had access to $20 gold pieces, that story didn't make sense. Unless there's something else, Dr. Whitman continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. When I was examining her, I noticed some scarring on her. Hands and arms, old scars, well healed but distinctive. The kind of marks you get from handling raw ore and mining equipment over long periods of time. So she worked in the mines? Bill Thompson asked. That's not so unusual. Plenty of Indian families work the smaller claims, especially when times are hard. Not worked in the mines, Dr. Whitman corrected. Owned mining equipment. There's a difference between the scars you get from swinging a pickaxe for wages and the marks you get from handling valuable ore, from making decisions about where to dig and when to stop. Those scars tell a story of ownership, not employment. The implications of this revelation hit Logan like a cave-in. If Lilu had experience owning mining equipment, if she had access to $20 gold pieces, if she was waiting in Copper Falls for some reason, despite having the means to leave, what was she really doing here? And why had she been sleeping in the snow if she had other options? Mrs. Pettigrew voiced the question that was forming in Logan's mind. Doctor, do you think she might be connected to one of the smaller claims in the area? Maybe her husband owned a mine instead of just working in one, and the company's trying to cover up the circumstances of his death. It's possible, Dr. Whitman admitted. But if that's the case, why would she be so secretive about it? And why would Blackstone be so eager to get rid of her? They usually don't care much about the widows of independent miners. There's not enough money involved to make it worth their trouble. Bill Townsend spat into the snow again, his expression thoughtful. Unless there's more money involved than we think. You hear stories sometimes about claims that look worthless on the surface, but hide major veins underneath. And you hear other stories about companies that use cave-ins and accidents to grab claims they couldn't buy legally. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a door opening somewhere nearby, followed by light footsteps crunching through the snow. Logan peered through the crack in the wall and saw a figure approaching, a woman wrapped in a heavy shawl, moving carefully but purposefully through the drifts. Even at a distance, he recognized Lilu's graceful bearing. Lilu approached the small group with the quiet dignity that Logan remembered from their encounter the night before. But something about her had changed. She moved with more confidence, her back straighter, her head held higher. The twins were bundled securely in her arms, and both children looked healthier than they had in the storm. Their faces had color, their breathing seemed easier, and the little girl was making soft cooing sounds that spoke of a belly finally filled with warm milk. Good morning, Lilu said, her voice stronger than it had been the night before, but still carrying that musical cadence that made even simple words sound like poetry. Dr. Whitman, I wanted to thank you again for your kindness last night. You saved my children's lives. Dr. Whitman stepped forward with a professional smile. How are you feeling this morning? Any dizziness or weakness? And how are Koda and Lila? Much better thanks to you, Lilu replied, then turned to address Mrs. Pettigrew and Bill Thompson. "And thank you both for your help, Mrs. Pettigrew. Your boarding house is the first place in weeks where my children have been truly warm. Mr. Thompson, I understand you helped carry supplies upstairs when I collapsed." Bill Thompson shuffled his feet awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with gratitude. "Wasn't nothing, ma'am. Anyone would have done the same." But his gruff tone suggested he was pleased by her thanks. Mrs. Pettigrew studied Lulu with sharp eyes, taking in details that Logan couldn't see from his hiding place. "You're looking much improved, dear. Dr. Whitman says you'll need several days of rest before you're strong enough to travel. Do you have somewhere to go when you're ready to leave Copper Falls?" Lulu was quiet for a moment, her gaze moving between the three faces watching her with varying degrees of curiosity and concern. When she spoke, her words seemed carefully chosen. "I have business to finish here first. Business concerning my husband's death and the circumstances surrounding it." "What kind of business?" Dr. Whitman asked gently. "If it's a matter of settling his affairs with the mining company, I should warn you that Blackstone doesn't have a reputation for treating widows fairly." A slight smile crossed Lulu's face, and Logan caught a glimpse of something steel-hard beneath her gentle exterior. "Dr. Whitman, I appreciate your concern, but I think you'll find that my husband's affairs are more complicated than anyone in this town realizes, including Blackstone Mining Company." Bill Thompson leaned forward, his prospector's instincts clearly aroused by the hint of hidden wealth. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, what exactly did your husband do for Blackstone? Because if he was just a regular miner, the company wouldn't be working so hard to get you out of town." Lulu shifted the twins in her arms, and Logan noticed how naturally she moved despite carrying two babies, as if she was accustomed to managing multiple responsibilities simultaneously. "My husband didn't work for Blackstone, Mr. Thompson. He worked despite Blackstone. And that, I believe, is why he died." The cryptic response hung in the air like smoke, and Logan could see the confusion on the faces of the three listeners. Dr. Whitman was the first to recover her composure. "Mrs. White Dove, if you have reason to believe your husband's death wasn't accidental, that's a matter for the territorial marshal. Have you considered contacting the authorities?" Lulu's laugh was bitter but musical. "Doctor, in this territory, Blackstone Mining Company is the authority. The marshal's salary is paid by company taxes. The judges are appointed with company approval, and the newspapers are funded by company advertising. What justice do you think a dead Indian miner's widow would find through official channels?" Her words carried the weight of hard experience, and Logan realized that Lulu understood the political realities of Montana Territory far better than most residents. The mining companies didn't just extract silver from the mountains. They extracted compliance from the people, ensuring that legal and governmental systems served corporate interests rather than individual justice. Mrs. Pettigrew's expression had grown increasingly troubled as the conversation progressed. "Dear, if what you're suggesting is true, if Blackstone was involved in your husband's death, then you're in considerable danger by staying here. They have ways of dealing with people who ask uncomfortable questions." "I know," Lulu replied simply, "but running away won't bring my husband justice, and it won't prevent the same thing from happening to other families. Sometimes standing your ground is the only way to move forward." Bill Thompson was studying Lulu with the intense focus of a man trying to solve a puzzle. "Ma'am, I've been prospecting in this territory for over a decade, and I know most of the independent miners by reputation, if not by sight." "What was your husband's name? Maybe I knew him." Lulu hesitated for just a moment, as if weighing the risks of revealing information. Then she straightened her shoulders and met Bill's gaze directly. "His name was Joseph White Dove, but the claim he worked was registered under his Christian name, Joseph Whitman. And it wasn't a small claim, Mr. Thompson. It was the richest silver deposit in the territory." The silence that followed this revelation was profound. Dr. Whitman's face had gone pale. Mrs. Pettigrew's mouth had fallen open, and Bill Thompson looked like he'd been struck by lightning. Logan pressed his eye closer to the crack in the wall, hardly daring to breathe. The Whitman claim. Dr. Whitman whispered, her voice barely audible. You're talking about the Whitman claim, but that's impossible. Everyone knows the Whitman claim was bought out by Blackstone years ago after the owner died in a mining accident. Lilu's smile was sharp as winter steel. Everyone knows wrong, Doctor. The Whitman claim was never sold to Blackstone. It was stolen. And now that Joseph is dead, it belongs to me, all of it. Every tunnel, every vein, every ounce of silver still in the mountain. Logan felt the world shift around him as the full implications of Lilu's revelation sank in. The Whitman claim was legendary in mining circles, a deposit so rich that men had killed for the chance to work it, so valuable that it had financed half the development in the territory. If Lilu really owned it, if she was the rightful heir to one of the largest silver fortunes in the American West, then her presence in Copper Falls wasn't about seeking charity or justice. It was about taking back an empire. The silence that followed Lilu's declaration stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Bill Thompson was the first to find his voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. The Whitman claim. Sweet Mother of God, you're talking about the Whitman claim. He looked around as if expecting Blackstone agents to materialize. From the morning mist, drawn by the mere mention of the legendary mine, Dr. Whitman stepped closer to Lilu, her medical training overriding her shock as she noticed the way the young woman swayed slightly on her feet. You need to sit down. This conversation is too important to have while you're still recovering from hypothermia. She gestured toward the boarding house. Mrs. Pettigrew, perhaps we could continue this discussion somewhere more private. Mrs. Pettigrew nodded quickly, her boarding housekeeper's instincts taking over. Of course. My parlor should be private enough, and I can make coffee. She paused, studying Lilu with new eyes. Though I suspect we're going to need something stronger than coffee before this conversation is finished. As the group moved toward the boarding house, Logan made a quick decision. He couldn't stay hidden in the stable forever, and if Lilu really owned the richest silver mine in the territory, she was going to need allies who understood how dangerous her situation had become. He climbed down from the loft as quietly as possible and followed at a distance, staying in the shadows between buildings, inside Mrs. Pettigrew's parlor, with the twins settled on a thick quilt near the fireplace and cups of steaming coffee. Warming everyone's hands, Lilu began to tell a story that would change everything Logan thought he knew about Copper Falls, about Blackstone mining, and about the web of corruption that stretched from the territorial capital all the way to Washington, D.C. My husband's grandfather was a French trapper named Jean-Baptiste Whitman, Lilu began, her voice taking on the cadence of someone recounting a family history that had been passed down through generations. He came to this territory in 1851. Before there were mining camps, before there were companies, when this was still just wilderness and the promise of gold in California streams. But Jean-Baptiste was smarter than most gold seekers. He looked for silver instead of gold, and he looked in places other men were afraid to go. She shifted little Lakota to a more comfortable position in her arms, the movement automatic and practiced. He found the main vein in 1853, but he was smart enough to keep it secret. He registered the claim under multiple names, using different variations of his surname, and he built a cabin that looked like a simple trapper's shelter, but was actually positioned to guard the mine entrance. For 20 years, he worked that claim alone, taking out just enough silver to live comfortably, but never enough to attract attention. Bill Thompson leaned forward, his prospector's instincts fully engaged. 20 years of secret mining? Ma'am, that's not possible. A man can't hide a major silver operation for 2 decades, not in territory this small. Someone would have noticed. Lilu's smile was sad but proud. Mr. Thompson, you're thinking like a white man's miner. Jean-Baptiste learned from my people, from the Arikara, from the Lakota, from tribes who had been hiding valuable resources from enemies for generations. He didn't blast and excavate like the big operations. He followed natural caves and existing fault lines, working with the mountain instead of against it. And he had help. Dr. Whitman set down her coffee cup with a sharp clink. Help from whom? From my grandfather's people, Lulu replied. Jean-Baptiste married into the Arikara tribe in 1855. My great-grandmother was the daughter of a chief, and she brought more than just a wife's companionship to the marriage. She brought knowledge of the sacred places in these mountains, the hidden paths, the seasonal rhythms that would allow a mining operation to remain invisible to outsiders. Mrs. Pettigrew shook her head in amazement. So the Whitman claim isn't just one man's discovery, it's a partnership between French ingenuity and Indian knowledge that lasted for decades. Exactly, Lulu confirmed. And when Jean-Baptiste died in 1873, he passed the claim to his son, my husband's father. Then in 1876, when the elder Joseph died in a hunting accident, ownership passed to my husband. But by then, things had changed. Blackstone Mining had arrived in the territory, and they were buying up every major claim they could find. The warmth from the fireplace couldn't dispel the chill that settled over the room as Lulu continued her story. Logan, listening from outside the parlor window where he'd positioned himself behind a snow-covered shrub, felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place with disturbing clarity. At first, Blackstone tried to buy the claim legitimately. Lulu said. They sent representatives with offers that started reasonable and quickly became extravagant. When Joseph refused to sell, they tried intimidation men following him when he went to town, equipment mysteriously breaking, supplies disappearing from our cabin. Why didn't your husband just sell? Dr. Whitman asked. If the offers were substantial, you could have lived comfortably anywhere in the country. Lulu's expression hardened. Because the mine isn't just a source of silver, Doctor. It's a sacred place to my people, and it's a promise Joseph made to his grandfather. Jean-Baptiste made his son swear that the claim would never be sold to mining companies who would strip the mountain bare and leave nothing but poisoned earth behind. The Whitman claim was meant to provide for future generations, not to make rich men richer. Bill Thompson was nodding slowly, his weathered face creased with understanding. So Blackstone couldn't buy it, couldn't intimidate him into selling, and couldn't find a legal way to take it. That left them with one option, murder, Lulu said simply, though they were careful to make it look like an accident. Outside the window, Logan felt his blood turn to ice as Lulu described the events leading up to her husband's death. He'd been in the Blackstone mine the day of the No. 3 shaft cave-in, had helped dig through the rubble, had seen the bodies when they brought them up. But Lulu's version of events painted a very different picture than the official company report. Joseph received a message that morning, Lulu continued, her voice steady despite the pain of recounting her husband's final day. A message, supposedly from one of the Blackstone foremen, asking him to come to the No. 3 shaft to consult about a technical problem. Joseph had a reputation as one of the best mining engineers in the territory. Men often sought his advice about difficult excavations. Mrs. Pettigrew frowned. But why would Blackstone ask for help from someone they'd been trying to intimidate? That doesn't make sense. It makes perfect sense if you understand their real purpose, Lulu replied. They needed Joseph in a specific place at a specific time, somewhere underground where an accident could be arranged without witnesses. The No. 3 shaft was perfect unstable geology, minimal supervision, easy to stage a cave-in that would look natural. Dr. Whitman's medical training made her focus on details others might miss. How can you be certain it wasn't really an accident? Cave-ins happen in mines. It's an unfortunate reality of the profession. Lulu reached into the folds of her dress and pulled out a small leather pouch. From it, She extracted what looked like a piece of twisted metal, blackened, with age and handling. Because of this, Joseph always carried his father's old compass when he went underground, a family tradition dating back to Jean-Baptiste. When they brought his body up, this compass was in his pocket, but it had been damaged by an explosion, not by falling. Rocks. She handed the compass to Dr. Whitman, who examined it carefully. The metal is definitely damaged by intense heat and chemical action, not by physical impact. This looks like blast damage. Exactly, Lulu confirmed. Someone set off dynamite in that shaft, then collapsed the tunnel to hide the evidence. Joseph wasn't killed by an accident. He was murdered by men who wanted to steal his mine. Bill. Thompson's face had gone red with anger. Those bastards. Excuse my language, ladies, but those company sons of... He caught himself and took a deep breath. M.A.A.M., if what you're saying is true, then Blackstone didn't just kill your husband. They've been murdering claim holders all over the territory. The implications of this realization hit everyone in the room simultaneously. If Blackstone was systematically murdering independent miners to steal their claims, then every small operation in the territory was at risk. More than that, it meant the company had resources and connections that went far beyond simple corporate greed. They had the ability to commit murder and cover it up through official channels. It gets worse, Lilu said, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering news that would shatter comfortable illusions. Joseph wasn't just investigating his own mine in the months before his death. He'd been contacted by other widows, other families who suspected their loved ones hadn't died in genuine accidents. He was building a case. She pulled another item from her leather pouch, a small notebook bound in oiled leather, its pages filled with careful handwriting in multiple languages. This contains the names of 17 miners who died in accidents over the past 3 years. All of them owned independent claims. All of them had refused to sell to Blackstone. And all of them died under circumstances that don't match the official reports. Dr. Whitman accepted the notebook with the reverence to do evidence that could bring down an empire. As she flipped through the pages, her face grew increasingly pale. These dates, these locations, I remember treating some of these men before they died. The injuries I saw didn't match the explanations I was given. Because you were lied to, Lilu said. The company doctor, the one they call for all mining accidents, he's part of the conspiracy. He falsifies death certificates, bribes coroners, ensures that no uncomfortable questions get asked when inconvenient people die. Logan, listening from outside, remembered Dr. Marcus Henderson, the company physician who'd been too drunk to help Sarah when she was dying. Henderson had always seemed more businessman than doctor, more concerned with protecting company interests than treating patients. Now Logan understood why Henderson wasn't just incompetent. He was actively working to cover up murder. Mrs. Pettigrew set down her coffee cup with shaking hands. Dear God, how many people have they killed? How many families have been destroyed? More than we'll probably ever know, Lilu replied. But Joseph documented 17 cases where he found solid evidence of murder disguised as mining accidents. And those are just the ones he could prove. The actual number is probably much higher. Bill Thompson was pacing now, his anger making it impossible for him to sit still. We have to take this to the territorial marshal. This is evidence of mass murder. The federal government will have to intervene. Lilu's laugh was bitter. Mr. Thompson, who do you think appointed the territorial marshal? Who do you think pays his salary and funds his office? Blackstone Mining Company has investments in railroads, in shipping, in banks all across the territory. They don't just own mines, they own the entire governmental structure. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. If Blackstone's influence reached into the territorial government, if they could manipulate marshals and judges and coroners, then conventional justice was impossible. They weren't just fighting a mining company, they were fighting a shadow government, that operated outside the law while using legal institutions to protect itself. The conversation was interrupted by urgent knocking at the front door of the boarding house. Mrs. Pettigrew rose to answer it, but before she could reach the hallway, the door burst open and Frank Morrison strode in. Flanked by two men Logan didn't recognize, hard-faced, men with the kind of confident brutality that came from knowing they could act with impunity. "Mrs. Pettigrew," Morrison said, his voice carrying false civility that fooled no one. "I'm afraid there's been a development in the situation we discussed earlier. The Territorial Health Inspector has raised concerns about unauthorized persons residing in your establishment, and we're going to need to conduct an immediate inspection." Dr. Whitman stood slowly, her medical bag clutched in one hand. "Mr. Morrison, my patients are still under medical care. Any inspection will have to wait until they're fit to be moved." "I'm afraid that's not acceptable, Doctor," Morrison replied. His companions moved to flank the parlor entrance, effectively blocking any escape route. Health and safety regulations take precedence over individual medical concerns. "We have reports of contagious disease, unsanitary conditions, potential threats to public welfare." Li Lu rose from her chair with fluid grace, settling the twins more securely in her arms. Logan could see tension in every line of her body, but her voice remained calm. "What kind of threats, Mr. Morrison?" "Two babies and a woman recovering from exposure hardly seemed dangerous to anyone." Morrison's smile was predatory. "Well now, that depends on what else you might be carrying. Disease, seditious ideas, false claims about company property, all sorts of things can threaten community welfare if they're allowed to spread unchecked." The threat was clear. Morrison wasn't here for a health inspection. He was here to eliminate the threat that Lulu and her evidence represented. And judging by the way his companions carried themselves, they were prepared to use whatever force necessary to achieve their goals. Bill Thompson stepped closer to Lulu, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Morrison, I think you've got your facts confused. This lady and her children are guests of Mrs. Pettigrew, under the medical care of Dr. Whitman, and protected by territorial law regarding the treatment of families in distress." "Territorial law," Morrison repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. "Mr. Thompson, I think you'll find that territorial law is subject to interpretation, especially when it conflicts with legitimate business interests and community safety concerns." Outside the window, Logan made a decision that would change the course of everything that followed. He'd been hiding long enough, watching while good people faced down evil with nothing but courage and determination. It was time to even the odds. Logan stepped through the front door of the boarding house, his old Navy Colt in his hand and his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from having nothing left to lose. "Morrison, I think you'll find that territorial law is also backed up by territorial justice, and sometimes justice comes from unexpected directions." The standoff that followed would determine whether truth and courage could prevail against corporate power and systematic corruption, or whether the Whitman claim would disappear forever into the bloody hands of men who valued silver more than human life. The parlor of Mrs. Pettigrew's boarding house had become a powder keg with too many lit fuses. Logan stood in the doorway, his Navy Colt steady in his hand, while Morrison's two enforcers reached for their own weapons with the practiced ease of men who solved problems with violence. The twins in Lilu's arms seemed to sense the danger little. Leela had stopped cooing, and Kota's eyes were wide with the kind of preternatural awareness that children possess in moments of crisis. "Well, well," Morrison said, his voice carrying the oily satisfaction of a man who believed he held all the cards. "Logan Cross, I heard you'd crawled back into town like a whipped dog. Didn't expect to find you playing knight in shining armor to a squaw and her half-breed bastards." The racial slur hit Logan like a physical blow, but he kept his gun trained on Morrison's chest. "Watch your mouth, Morrison. There are ladies present, and even a snake like you should have some manners." Dr. Whitman stepped forward, her medical bag clutched like a shield. "Mr. Morrison, this is a private residence and my patients are under medical protection. You have no legal authority to—" "Legal authority?" Morrison laughed, the sound harsh and grating. "Doctor, I think you misunderstand the situation. In Copper Falls, Blackstone Mining Company is the law. We decide what's legal and what isn't." He gestured to his companions. "Meet Deputies Johnson and Black, officially appointed by the Territorial Marshal to maintain order in mining districts." Bill Thompson spat into the fireplace, the sound expressing his opinion of Morrison's claims more eloquently than words. "Appointed deputies, my ass. Those are hired guns, Morrison, and everyone in this room knows it." The man Morrison had identified as Johnson stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of a well-used Remington revolver. He was tall and lean, with the kind of pale eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. "Mr. Thompson, you'd be wise to show proper respect for territorial authority. Resisting lawful orders is a serious offense in these parts." Logan studied Johnson's face and felt recognition click into place like a puzzle piece. "I know you," he said slowly. "You're Jake Johnson from the Silver Creek incident 2 years ago. Heard you killed 6 homesteaders who wouldn't sell their land to Eastern investors." Johnson's smile was cold as winter steel. "Heard a lot of things about that incident. Heard those homesteaders were armed desperados who resisted lawful eviction. Heard they fired first. Heard the territorial government awarded medals for exemplary service to the survivors. Heard you're a murdering son of a bitch who kills families for money." Logan replied, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man who'd seen enough evil to recognize it on sight. The second enforcer, Black, was shorter and broader than his companion, with the kind of thick build that came from years of hard physical labor before he'd discovered easier ways to make money. His hands were scarred and calloused, and Logan noticed that he wore his guns low on his hips in the manner of someone who expected to draw fast and shoot often. "Enough talk," Black said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Logan couldn't place. "Morrison, you want this handled quiet or loud?" Morrison glanced around the parlor, taking in the witnesses, the confined space, the potential complications of violence in a respectable establishment. "Quiet would be preferable, but loud will work if necessary. The important thing is that certain problems get resolved permanently." Lilu shifted the twins in her arms, and Logan saw her exchange a meaningful glance with Dr. Whitman. Something passed between the two women, a plan, perhaps, or simply an understanding of what needed to be done. When Lilu spoke, her voice carried the kind of steel that had helped her ancestors survive centuries of warfare and displacement. "Mr. Morrison, before you do something irreversible, you should know that my husband's evidence isn't the only documentation of Blackstone's crimes. There are copies hidden in multiple locations, along with detailed instructions for their distribution if anything happens to me or my children." Morrison's confidence flickered for the first time since entering the boarding house. "You're bluffing. If you had that kind of insurance, you wouldn't be hiding in a boarding house in the middle of nowhere, wouldn't I?" Lilu smiled, and Logan saw in that expression the same fierce intelligence that had kept her people alive against impossible odds. "Mr. Morrison, did you really think a woman who inherited the richest silver mine in the territory would be foolish enough to put all her trust in the honesty of white men's justice?" Mrs. Pettigrew had been quietly moving around the room during the confrontation, ostensibly tending to domestic tasks but actually positioning herself near a cabinet that Logan suddenly realized might contain more than linens and china. When she spoke, her voice carried an authority that seemed to come from nowhere. "Mr. Morrison," she said, opening the cabinet to reveal a double-barreled shotgun that looked well-maintained and recently cleaned, "I think you've overstayed your welcome in my establishment. As the proprietor of this boarding house and a tax-paying citizen of this territory, I'm formally requesting that you and your companions leave immediately." Morrison stared at the shotgun with the expression of a man who'd suddenly realized he'd walked into a trap. "Mrs. Pettigrew, you can't be serious. You're threatening territorial deputies in the performance of their duties. I'm protecting my guests from armed intruders who have failed to present proper warrants or legal documentation." Mrs. Pettigrew replied calmly. "Dr. Whitman, would you please confirm that my patients are still under medical care and therefore protected by territorial health statutes?" Dr. Whitman straightened her shoulders, drawing on the authority that came from being the only qualified physician within 50 miles. "Mrs. White Dove and her children are under my direct medical supervision and cannot be moved without my professional approval. Any attempt to forcibly relocate them would violate territorial medical protection laws and could result in the loss of life." Bill Thompson moved to stand beside Mrs. Pettigrew, his own weapon now visible in his hand. "Morrison, seems like you've got yourself outnumbered and outgunned. Might be time to reconsider your options." But Morrison wasn't finished. Logan could see the calculation in his eyes, the weighing of risks and rewards that came from years of using violence to solve problems that couldn't be resolved through legitimate means. "You people don't understand what you're dealing with," Morrison said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "This isn't about one Indian woman or one silver mine. This is about the future of this territory, about progress and civilization and the natural order of things." "Natural order?" Dr. Whitman's voice was sharp with anger. "Is murder part of your natural order, Mr. Morrison? Is stealing from widows and orphans part of progress?" Morrison's mask slipped entirely, revealing the cold brutality that lay beneath his facade of respectability. "Doctor, in the real world, weak people get crushed by strong people. That's not cruelty, that's evolution. Blackstone Mining Company represents strength, efficiency, the kind of modern enterprise that builds nations. A few dead Indians and failed prospectors are a small price to pay for the greater good." The words hung in the air like poison, and Logan felt something snap inside him. He'd heard similar justifications before, from slavers who claimed their human cargo was better off in bondage, from cavalry officers who described massacres as necessary steps toward civilization, from politicians who explained away genocide as manifest destiny. Evil always dressed itself in the clothes of progress and necessity. "Morrison," Logan said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet rage that was more dangerous than shouting, "I've heard enough of your philosophy. Time for you and your boys to leave before this gets uglier than it already is." Johnson and Black had been edging closer during the conversation, and Logan realized with professional assessment that they were positioning themselves for a coordinated attack. These weren't just hired guns, they were experienced killers who knew how to work together, how to create crossfire, how to eliminate multiple targets efficiently. "Actually," Johnson said, his pale eyes fixed on Logan's face, "I think it's time for everyone to stop pretending this is a social call. Morrison, give the word and we'll clean this up permanent-like." What happened next unfolded with the terrible clarity that comes in moments of life and death violence. Johnson went for his gun first, his hand moving with practiced speed toward the Remington on his hip. Logan was faster. Years of survival in mining camps and frontier towns had honed his reflexes to a razor's edge. His Navy Colt barked once, the sound deafening in the confined space of the parlor. Johnson spun backward, clutching his shoulder, his own weapon only half drawn. But Black was already moving, diving behind Mrs. Pettigrew's heavy oak table, while pulling both his pistols in a movement that spoke of countless hours of practice. Logan threw himself sideways, knocking over a chair as Black's first shot splintered the doorframe where Logan's head had been a moment before. Mrs. Pettigrew's shotgun roared like thunder, both barrels firing simultaneously and filling the air with smoke and the acrid smell of black powder. Logan heard Black scream, not the cry of a man who'd been hit, but the sound of someone who'd been caught in the peripheral blast of buckshot and was more angry than injured, in the chaos. That followed, Logan lost track of individual actions. He saw Dr. Whitman throwing herself over Lele and the twins, shielding them with her own body. Bill Thompson was shouting something about territorial law, while firing his own weapon at shadows moving through the gun smoke. Mrs. Pettigrew was reloading her shotgun with the calm efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before. Morrison had disappeared in the confusion, but Logan could hear his voice shouting orders from somewhere in the boarding house's hallway. "Burn it down if you have to. The woman and the evidence can't leave this building alive." The smell of smoke that suddenly filled the air wasn't just from discharged weapons. Someone had set fire to something, the curtains, the furniture, or perhaps the building itself. Orange light began to flicker beyond the parlor windows, and Logan realized with cold certainty that Morrison had decided to solve his problems with arson. "We have to get out of here." Dr. Whitman shouted over the sound of crackling flames and continuing gunfire. "The whole building is going to go up." But escape wasn't going to be simple. Logan could hear voices outside the boarding house, more of Morrison's men, surrounding the building to ensure that no one escaped alive. They weren't just dealing with 3 hired guns anymore. They were facing a coordinated assault, designed to eliminate witnesses and destroy evidence. Lulu stood in the middle of the chaos, still holding her twins, her face calm despite the violence swirling around her. When she spoke, her voice cut through the noise like a blade. "There's another way out. Mrs. Pettigrew, do you have access to your cellar?" Mrs. Pettigrew nodded, still reloading her shotgun with mechanical precision. "Through the kitchen. But it only leads to the alley behind the building." "That's not where it leads," Lulu said. And Logan heard something in her voice that suggested she knew more about the boarding house's construction than should have been possible. "Mrs. Pettigrew, your building sits on the same foundation as the old trading post that was here before the town was established. There are tunnels underneath this entire block, tunnels that connect to natural cave systems in the mountains." Bill Thompson stared at her through the smoke. "How the hell do you know that?" "Because my husband's great-grandfather helped build those tunnels," Lulu replied. Jean-Baptiste Whitman wasn't just a trapper, he was part of an underground network that helped escaped slaves reach Canada, that smuggled supplies to friendly Indian tribes, that moved people and goods without detection by authorities. Those tunnels are how he kept his mining operation secret for 20 years. The revelation hit Logan like a thunderbolt. If tunnels connected the boarding house to the mountains, if they led to the Whitman claim itself, then Lulu hadn't been trapped in Copper Falls by circumstances. She'd been using the town as a base of operations, preparing for something larger than anyone had imagined. Mrs. Pettigrew was nodding slowly, pieces of local history clicking into place in her mind. "The cold draft in the cellar that I could never explain. The way sounds echo from underneath. The floorboards. I always wondered why this building stayed cooler in summer than it should have." Dr. Whitman grabbed her medical bag and moved toward the kitchen. "Then we go through the cellar. But we need to move fast, this smoke is getting thicker, and someone's going to need medical attention before this is over." Logan took one last look around the parlor that had been transformed from a place of civilized conversation into a battlefield. Johnson was still alive but wounded, probably out of the fight. Black was somewhere in the smoke, possibly regrouping for another attack. Morrison was outside coordinating what sounded like a small army of hired guns and company enforcers. But as they moved toward the kitchen, Logan heard something that made his blood run cold, the sound of many horses approaching at speed, accompanied by the shouts of men who weren't part of Morrison's original group. Through the smoke-filled windows he could see torches and lanterns, dozens of them, surrounding the boarding house like fireflies around carrion. "They've called in reinforcements," Bill Thompson said grimly. "Looks like Blackstone decided to bring their whole private army to this party." Lulu adjusted her grip on the twins and headed for the cellar stairs. "Then it's time for them to learn that some fights are more dangerous than they appear. Mr. Cross, are you ready to see what a real silver mine looks like?" Logan followed her into the darkness below, realizing that everything that had happened so far, the violence, the revelations, the desperate escape, had been merely the opening moves in a much larger game. Somewhere in the tunnels beneath Copper Falls lay the truth about the Whitman claim, about Blackstone's crimes, and about a conspiracy that reached far beyond one Montana mining town. Behind them, Mrs. Pettigrew's boarding house burned like a beacon against the night sky, sending smoke signals that would be visible for miles. But ahead lay darkness, uncertainty, and the promise that before sunrise, either justice would be served or everyone who knew the truth about the richest silver mine in the territory would be dead. The cellar beneath Mrs. Pettigrew's boarding house was a revelation in itself. What should have been a simple storage space for preserves and winter supplies instead opened into a carefully constructed chamber lined with dressed stone that spoke of engineering far more sophisticated than anything found in typical frontier buildings. Lilu moved through the darkness with the confidence of someone who had walked these paths before, while Logan and the others followed with the uncertain steps of people discovering that their familiar world contained hidden depths they'd never imagined. Dr. Whitman held her medical bag in one hand and a lantern in the other, casting dancing shadows on walls that showed clear evidence of deliberate construction. "These aren't natural caves," she observed, running her fingers along mortared joints between stones. "Someone built this as a permanent installation, designed to last for decades." Jean-Baptiste was a military engineer before he became a trapper, Lilu explained, leading them deeper into the tunnel system. He served under Napoleon in the Russian campaign, learned how to build fortifications that could withstand siege warfare. When he came to America, he brought those skills with him. The tunnel they were following sloped gently upward, heading toward the mountains that surrounded Copper Falls. Bill Thompson, bringing up the rear and listening for sounds of pursuit, marveled at the construction. This must have taken years to build. How did he manage it without anyone noticing? "The same way he kept the mine secret," Lilu replied. "He worked only at night, moved the excavated material through natural watercourses during spring floods, and used tribal hunting parties as cover for bringing in construction materials. My great-grandmother's people thought they were helping build storm shelters and food storage areas." Behind them, the sounds from the boarding house were growing fainter, the crackle of flames, the shouts of Morrison's men, the occasional gunshot as searchers found nothing but empty rooms and smoke. Logan felt a grim satisfaction, knowing that Morrison would find no evidence in the ashes, no bodies to prove his mission successful. But satisfaction was tempered by the knowledge that this was only a temporary reprieve. Mrs. Pettigrew moved with surprising agility for a woman her age, her years of managing a frontier boarding house having kept her stronger than her matronly appearance suggested. "How far do these tunnels extend?" she asked. "And where exactly are we going?" Lilu paused at a junction where 3 passages diverged in different directions, each marked with symbols carved into the stone symbols that combined French engineering marks with Arikara pictographs in a way that created a unique navigation system. The main network extends for nearly 20 miles through the mountains, with dozens of branches and multiple entrances. But we're going to the heart of it all, the Whitman claim itself. The passage she chose led steadily upward, and Logan began to notice that the air was growing cooler and cleaner, suggesting they were moving away from the valley floor and into the mountains proper. The walls showed increasing signs of natural cave formation, indicating that Jean-Baptiste had connected his artificial tunnels to existing geological features. After what felt like hours but was probably less than one, they reached a chamber that took Logan's breath away. The tunnel opened into a vast natural cavern, its ceiling lost in darkness above their lantern light. But what made the space truly remarkable was what it contained: an underground lake fed by mountain springs, its surface black as obsidian, and perfectly still, reflecting their lights like a mirror made of liquid night. "My God," Dr. Whitman whispered, her voice echoing in the vast space. "This is beautiful." But how does it connect to the mine? Lilu smiled, the expression barely visible in the lantern light, but audible in her voice. Dr. Whitman, this isn't just connected to the mine. This is the mine. The Whitman claim isn't a traditional excavation, it's a system of natural and artificial chambers that follow silver veins through the mountain's heart. Jean-Baptiste didn't fight the mountain's structure, he worked with it. As they made their way around the edge of the underground lake, following a path that showed signs of regular use, Logan began to understand the true scope of what Jean-Baptiste Whitman had discovered and built. This wasn't just a silver mine. It was an underground fortress, a hidden city, a complex that could support dozens of people for months while remaining completely invisible to the outside world. They passed chambers filled with preserved food, supplies, others containing mining equipment that looked both well-maintained and recently used. There were workshops with tools for refining ore, living quarters with bunks and furniture, even a chapel of sorts where Christian crosses stood alongside Arikara spiritual symbols in a display of religious harmony that Logan had never seen before. How many people know about this place? Bill Thompson asked, his prospector's mind clearly calculating the value of what they were seeing. Because this represents more wealth than most countries possess. Fewer than you might think, Lilu replied. The tribal elders who helped build it are mostly dead now. The French trappers who served as Jean-Baptiste's initial workforce moved on to other territories decades ago. By the time Joseph inherited the claim, knowledge of its full extent was limited to our immediate family. Mrs. Pettigrew was examining the living quarters with the practiced eye of someone who understood domestic logistics. These facilities could support a small army. Was Jean-Baptiste planning for war? In a sense, yes, Lilu admitted. He believed that eventually, the federal government and large corporations would try to seize control of all valuable resources in the territory. He wanted to create a place where independent people could retreat, regroup, and continue to resist. No matter what happened in the outside world, Logan was beginning to understand that they weren't just hiding from Morrison and his hired guns. They were stepping into a carefully prepared battlefield where the advantage lay with whoever controlled the high ground, the water supply, and the multiple escape routes. Lilu, when you came to Copper Falls, you weren't looking for help. You were preparing for war. Her smile was fierce and proud. Logan Cross, my husband didn't just leave me a silver mine. He left me a revolution. And tonight, Blackstone Mining Company is going to learn what happens when they try to steal from people who refuse to be victims. As they moved deeper into the complex, Logan realized that Lilu had been far from alone in her preparations. They began encountering other people, men and women who emerged from side passages with the quiet confidence of those who belonged in this underground realm. Some were clearly Arikara, others looked like miners or settlers, but all carried themselves with the bearing of people who had made a conscious choice to resist rather than submit. Joseph spent the last year of his life recruiting allies. Lilu explained as introductions were made around a central chamber that served as the complex's heart. Miners whose claims had been stolen, families driven from their land, tribal members who refused to accept reservation life, even some federal employees who discovered Blackstone's corruption and chose conscience over career. Logan found himself shaking hands with Samuel Morrison, Frank Morrison's own brother, who had served as a territorial tax assessor until he discovered that Blackstone was systematically underreporting their mineral extraction to avoid federal taxation. My brother chose money over family, Samuel said quietly. I chose justice over comfort. We've been expecting this confrontation for months. Dr. Whitman was setting up a medical station in one of the side chambers, assisted by a woman introduced as Maria Santos, a former army nurse who had deserted rather than participate in what she termed genocidal medical experimentation on reservation populations. We've been treating refugees from Blackstone's expansion for the better part of a year, Maria explained. People who were supposed to have died in mining accidents, but somehow managed to escape. The scope of the resistance network was staggering. Bill Thompson found himself talking with Henry Black Eagle, an Arikara war chief who had been legally declared dead after refusing to sign a treaty that would have surrendered tribal mineral rights. "The federal government believes our people are scattered and defeated," Black Eagle said. "They have no idea how many of us have simply disappeared into places like this, waiting for the right moment to reclaim what was stolen." Mrs. Pettigrew discovered that her boarding house had been under surveillance by the resistance for months, its location making it perfect for observing Blackstone's activities while maintaining the appearance of innocent civilian life. "You mean my guests have been spies?" she asked, sounding more fascinated than offended. "Intelligence gatherers," Lilu corrected diplomatically. "People positioned to document Blackstone's crimes and provide warning when the company decided to escalate their activities. Your kindness to travelers and refugees made you a natural ally, even if you didn't know it at the time." Logan was beginning to understand that everything that had happened since he gave Lilu his silver dollar had been part of a larger plan. "You've been manipulating events from the beginning," he said, though his tone carried more admiration than accusation. "The encounter outside the stable, the revelation about the mine, even Morrison's attack on the boarding house, you've been guiding everything toward this moment." Lilu adjusted her grip on the twins, who had slept peacefully through most of their underground journey, apparently accustomed to their mother's nomadic lifestyle. "Logan, I needed to know what kind of man you were before I could trust you with the truth. A person's character shows most clearly when they have nothing to gain and everything to lose. When you gave me your last dollar, you proved you were someone worth saving." Their preparations were interrupted by the arrival of a new group through one of the tunnel entrances, men in federal uniforms who moved with military precision but carried themselves with the authority of law enforcement rather than army regulars. Logan's hand moved instinctively toward his gun until Lilu placed a restraining touch on his arm. "These are friends," she said, then called out in a voice that carried clearly through the chamber. "Marshal Davidson, your timing is excellent. We were just preparing to show Mr. Morrison the consequences of his actions." United States Marshal Robert Davidson was a tall, weathered man with gray hair and the kind of steady eyes that came from years of enforcing federal law in places where local authority had been corrupted or compromised. He moved through the underground complex with professional interest, clearly impressed by what he was seeing. "Mrs. White Dove," he said, touching his hat brim in a gesture of respect. "I received your message through our mutual contacts in Denver. The federal investigation into Blackstone Mining Company has been authorized at the highest levels, and we have warrants for the arrest of 17 individuals on charges ranging from tax evasion to conspiracy to commit murder." Logan felt a surge of hope mixed with confusion. "Federal investigation? How long has this been in the works?" Marshal Davidson consulted a leather-bound notebook. "Mr. Cross, the Treasury Department has been investigating irregularities in territorial mineral taxation for over 2 years. Mrs. White Dove's documentation of systematic claim theft and murder provided the evidence we needed to expand our investigation to include charges that will result in federal prosecution." Samuel Morrison stepped forward, his face bearing the strain of a man who had chosen family loyalty over blood loyalty. "Marshal, my brother Frank is currently in Copper Falls with a force of at least 30 hired gunmen. They're operating under the pretense of territorial law enforcement, but they're actually a private army funded by Blackstone's Eastern investors. We're aware of the situation," Marshal Davidson replied. "Federal troops are moving into position around Copper Falls as we speak. However, we need more than just evidence of tonight's violence. We need documentation that proves systematic criminal conspiracy spanning multiple territories and involving federal officials." Lilu moved to a section of the chamber where wooden crates were stacked along the wall, each marked with dates and locations in the same careful handwriting Logan had seen in her husband's notebook. Marshall Davidson, what you need is 3 years' worth of documented evidence, including photographs, witness testimonies, financial records, and physical proof of Blackstone's criminal activities. As she opened the crates, revealing an archive that represented the most comprehensive documentation of corporate crime Logan had ever seen, he realized that Joseph White Dove hadn't just been investigating individual murders, he had been building a case that would bring down an entire criminal enterprise and reshape the political structure of the Montana Territory. My God, Dr. Whitman breathed, looking at photographs that showed mine entrances before and after suspicious accidents, financial ledgers that documented bribes to territorial officials, even correspondence between Blackstone executives and Eastern investors discussing the elimination of obstacles to progress. This is enough evidence to prosecute dozens of people, maybe hundreds. Marshall Davidson was nodding with the satisfaction of a lawman who had finally assembled all the pieces of a complex puzzle. Mrs. White Dove, this documentation represents the most significant case of territorial corruption in the history of the American West. When this becomes public, it will trigger federal intervention not just in Montana, but in territories throughout the region. But even as the promise of justice began to feel real, Logan could hear sounds echoing through the tunnel system, sounds that suggested Morrison and his private army had discovered the entrance to the underground complex and were preparing for an assault that would determine whether truth and law could triumph over money and violence. The sounds from the tunnels were growing closer, the scrape of boots on stone, the muffled voices of men trying to move quietly through unfamiliar terrain, the occasional metallic clink of weapons and equipment. Morrison had found them, and he was bringing superior numbers into a confrontation that would determine the fate of everyone in the chamber. Lilu handed the twins to Dr. Whitman, then moved to a section of the chamber where levers and pulleys connected to chains that disappeared into the darkness above. Marshall Davidson, how long do you need to get this evidence to federal authorities? If we can reach the surface and signal my men, this case becomes federal jurisdiction immediately. Blackstone won't be able to use local influence to suppress it, the marshal replied, checking his weapons with professional efficiency. Then you'll have the time you need, Lilu said, pulling one of the levers. Somewhere in the mountain above them, Logan heard a deep rumbling sound, followed by what sounded like tons of rock shifting and settling. Jean-Baptiste designed this complex with multiple defensive features. The tunnel system can be sealed from inside, creating a fortress that could withstand siege for months. Bill Thompson was staring at the levers with the awed expression of someone who finally understood the scope of the engineering they were witnessing. You can control access to the entire mountain from this chamber. Blackstone's men are about to find themselves trapped in a maze they don't understand, while we sit here with all the supplies and escape routes. But Logan realized that Lilu had something more dramatic in mind than simply outlasting a siege. She was moving toward another set of controls. These connected to what looked like mining equipment, pumps, hydraulic systems, mechanisms that could redirect the underground water sources that fed the complex. Marshall Davidson, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had inherited not just wealth, but responsibility. When federal troops take control of Copper Falls, they're going to find evidence of Blackstone's crimes in places Morrison never imagined. And they're going to discover that the richest silver mine in the territory belongs to people who intend to use its wealth for justice rather than exploitation. As the sounds of Morrison's approach grew closer, Logan realized that the final confrontation wouldn't be fought with guns and violence, but with truth and law and the kind of justice that could reshape an entire territory. The woman he had given his last silver dollar to was about to become the most powerful person in the Montana Territory, and she intended to use that power to build something better than what had come before. 3 months after the night that changed everything, Logan Cross stood on the porch of the finest house in Copper Falls. watching the morning sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and silver. The house belonged to him, now a wedding gift from Lulu, who had become his wife in a ceremony that blended Arikara traditions with territorial law and drew witnesses from across the American West. The town below had transformed beyond recognition. Where Blackstone Mining Company's offices once stood, a new territorial courthouse dispensed justice under federal oversight. The boarding house district had been rebuilt as worker housing with running water and electricity luxuries funded by silver from the Whitman claim and administered by the Copper Falls Community Trust that Lulu had established. Marshall Davidson emerged from the house, carrying official documents that would complete the legal transformation of Montana Territory's mining industry. "Mrs. Cross," he said, addressing Lulu with the respect due to someone who had single-handedly exposed the largest corruption scandal in territorial history. The federal trials concluded yesterday. Frank Morrison received life imprisonment. His associates got sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years, and Blackstone Mining Company has been dissolved by court order. Lulu, now visibly pregnant with their first child together while Coda and Lila played in the garden under Dr. Whitman's watchful eye, smiled with satisfaction that carried no trace of vindictiveness. "What happens to their seized assets?" "Distributed to the families of murdered miners, as you requested," Marshall Davidson replied. "The federal government has also established new territorial regulations that require mining companies to prove legitimate, claim ownership and maintain safety standards enforced by federal inspectors rather than company employees." Logan marveled at how completely their world had changed. The resistance network that had operated from the underground complex now served as the foundation for a new, territorial government that prioritized individual rights over corporate profits. Samuel Morrison had been appointed territorial tax assessor, ensuring that mining companies paid their fair share to support schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. Mrs. Pettigrew, now managing 3 boarding houses funded by the community trust and serving as unofficial mayor of Copper Falls, joined them on the porch with coffee and the satisfied expression of someone whose life's work had achieved recognition and support. "The morning stage brought news from Washington," she announced. "Congress has passed the Territorial Mining Reform Act, and President Hayes has signed it into law. Every territory with significant mineral resources will now operate under federal oversight." Bill Thompson approached from the direction of the mines, his clothes dusty, but his face bearing the contentment of a man who finally owned his own claim rather than working for others. "Lulu, the new extraction equipment arrived from Denver. With the hydraulic systems Joseph designed, we're pulling more silver from the mountain while doing less damage to the environment. Your husband would be proud." The mention of Joseph brought a moment of respectful silence. His grave, marked with both Christian and Arikara symbols, had become a pilgrimage site for people seeking inspiration to fight their own battles against corruption and injustice. The twins visited their father's resting place every week, too young to understand his significance, but old enough to sense their mother's reverence. Dr. Whitman approached with Coda in her arms and Lila toddling beside her, both children healthy and thriving in ways that seemed impossible during that terrible winter night when Logan had first encountered their family. "The Territorial Medical College has approved our funding proposal," she announced. "We'll begin training doctors and nurses specifically to serve mining communities, with emphasis on treating injuries that companies have historically ignored or covered up." Logan felt a profound sense of completion as he surveyed the life they had built from the ashes of tragedy and injustice. The silver dollar he had given to a desperate woman in the snow had returned to him multiplied beyond calculation, not in monetary wealth, though the Whitman claim provided more than enough for comfortable living, but in the form of purpose, family, and the knowledge that individual acts of kindness could indeed change the world. As the sun climbed higher and the business of the day began in earnest, Logan reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The Whitman claim now operated as a cooperative enterprise, with profits shared among workers and substantial portions dedicated to education, healthcare, and supporting other communities fighting similar battles against exploitation. Lulu had kept her promise to repay his kindness, but not in the way Logan had expected. Rather than giving him money or position, she had given him something far more valuable, the opportunity to be part of something larger than himself, to help build a future where justice mattered more than profit, and where people like Frank Morrison could never again murder with impunity. The twins ran toward Logan with the boundless energy of children who had never known hunger or fear, calling him Papa Logan in voices that mixed English with Arikara words their mother taught them. As he lifted them into his arms, Logan realized that his greatest treasure wasn't the silver they had inherited or the justice they had achieved, but the family they had created from the ruins of loss. That evening, as Copper Falls settled into peaceful twilight, Logan and Lulu stood together watching the first stars appear over the mountains that had yielded their silver and their secrets. "Do you ever regret giving away that dollar?" Lulu asked, her hand resting on the swell of their coming child. Logan smiled, remembering the desperate man he had been and marveling at the content husband and father he had become. "Best investment I ever made," he said. "Though I had no idea I was buying shares in an empire." Lulu laughed, the sound carrying across the valley like music. "Logan Cross, you didn't buy shares in an empire. You invested in hope. And hope, as it turns out, pays the highest dividends of all." Above them, the mountains stood eternal and majestic, their silver veins gleaming in the starlight like promises that justice, once achieved, could endure for generations yet to come.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.